Welcome to Journey Through the Gate, your Paranormal Portal podcast, as we delve into the many questions and wonders brought on by the supernatural experience. What's on the other side of the gate? Let's find out together. Hello and welcome to this side of the gate. Tonight we are being walked through this side of the gate by one of my favorite people. His name is Jim Harold. He has been doing podcasts, multiple podcasts on the paranormal for well over a decade. He is a stellar storyteller, and he has wonderful views on the paranormal and everything included. So welcome with me, Mr. Jim Harold. Thank you for coming on, Jim.
Oh, thank you for the privilege to talk with you and your audience, and so glad to be here. It's a real honor.
Oh, thank you. The honor is all ours. Okay, let's jump right into it. You have multiple books that you have put together of stories that you've collected from your listeners, and they're absolutely wonderful. They're always on the top of the bestseller in the supernatural and paranormal. And anybody who's ever heard one of your podcasts, some of them are just absolutely fantastic. The Paranormal Podcast, the Campfire. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Campfire because I had a little insight into that. Being Native American, I have to tell you that being a storyteller is one of the most revered positions in a tribal community, because that is how traditions are kept alive. And,
right.
And you're basically gathered around your powwow fire. So I just always thought the concept of the campfire was great. Were you thinking that, like going back and camping and everybody gathers together with the flashlight on their face? I mean, what made you start that concept?
Well, the thing is that I wish I were that forward-thinking and that insightful, but the truth is I kind of lucked into it. What happened is I have my show, the Paranormal Podcast, which I started back in 2005, and this was 2009, and at that time I was doing, now it is my full-time job, and I do this as a profession, but at the time I had a full-time job, and I was doing the Paranormal Podcast on the side pretty much as like a hobby. Mm-hmm. And I had a week where I didn't have a guest. And I said, well, I've got to have a show. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be fun to spotlight the real supernatural stories of our audience? Mm-hmm. So I did one episode, and it was so well received. And I'm not the brightest bulb in the bunch or the sharpest tool in a drawer, however you want to say it. But I thought, people are asking for this. Maybe I should make a show. And I thought, well, let's see. What can I call it? It's kind of like we're all sitting around, we're telling ghost stories or stories of cryptids or UFOs. Boy, that sounds like a campfire. And, of course, I checked, and nobody had the Campfire Podcast name, so I said, well, now I do. So that's how it became the Campfire. And I must say this, and it very much plays into what you were saying. When I first started the show, I thought, well, this will be fun. This will be a fun thing. Mm-hmm. It'll be, just fun, like telling stories around the campfire. But I think in general, and this is not blowing my own horn, it's more about the concept of the show and definitely the storytellers who come on the show, because I'm just kind of a mediator, is that it's actually become in one ways, again, yes, a way that stories can survive. Mm-hmm. I know that we've been doing the show for 9 years now. Mm-hmm. So that has to mean that some of the people who have come on and told their stories are probably no longer with us. And so their stories have survived. And then also, I think that it also, in a way, and again, I'm speaking to the storytellers in the show, it really has nothing to do with me, that it's a way for people to know that they're not alone, that other people have experienced these things. So yes, I think it serves as a way to catalog the stories, to kind of give them a certain immortality. I certainly plan on the podcast being available as long as I'm around, and hopefully even after that, people will maybe listen to them because these stories are timeless.
Absolutely.
And then also is kind of like not in the clinical sense, but a little bit of a support group in that everybody knows that we all experience these strange things. And if something happens to me, I'm not weird. I'm just one of mankind and womankind that have experienced these things. That we're all kind of in this together. So it's actually been a lot more profound than I ever expected it would be, and that's why I think of all my shows, it resonates the most.
Absolutely. And on top of all that, then you've got the Paranormal Podcast, and I think some of your interviews with these individuals in the community are just some of the best.
Thank you.
Well, there's an awful lot. If you look at the sheer tonnage of paranormal podcasts and themes and TV shows and everything else, in our lifetime, it has changed so much because, if you were living in a house and you had some kind of activity and you go to work the next day, you're hiding it. We didn't go to school and talk about, hey, guess what come out of my closet last night? You kept it quiet. And
That's
that
right.
was one of the things that it was so difficult to find information. I can remember being maybe 10 and going into the library and asking the librarian, remember the Dewey Decimal System and the card systems in the library?
Oh, I do. Yes, I do.
Yes. And they wanted you to go look it up yourself. They didn't want you to ask them questions. You know how they were. And I asked the librarian, I said, I'm in a rush and I'm looking for true ghost stories. And she looked down her glasses, pulled down her glasses, looked down her nose at me and said, there are no true ghost stories.
That's horrible.
It is horrible, but that was the mentality. All this was bunk. And, if you were, something like this was going on, you were Looney Tunes. So now we've gone to this side and it's just absolutely, we've been saturated, I think, with it so much. It's almost hard to find the true ghost stories or the true photographs or the videos or the, whatever in this amazing amount of information. So we've kind of seen it almost come full circle. We're still trying
it's almost
to dig it out.
It's almost too much.
I know. And we're almost trying to dig it out. So I also, we have kind of a kindred spirit in the fact that we love the old classic shows, the In Search Ofs, the Unsolved Mysteries, the Sightings, and the way they used to do it. Do you not? I miss it so much.
Oh, the thing is that I kind of like the way that those shows approached it. It was more, again, I wouldn't call In Search Of journalism per se, but it was a little bit more, let's present the facts to you or the theories from these various people. And they do interviews with people like, if you're talking about UFOs, Stanton Friedman and so forth and so on. And I like that approach. And I don't really think, particularly on television, there's much room these days for that kind of approach. We all have to kind of be, they kind of have paranormal. If you talk paranormal television show today, what you're thinking about is 4 or 5 men and women running around an abandoned building with, night vision cameras. That's the wearing black T-shirts, of course. Mm-hmm. That's kind of what you envision. And I'm not saying all of those are bad, or certainly all ghost hunting teams are bad. I would never say that at all. Mm-hmm. But I think that, talking about this stuff seriously, now on the Campfire, we have a little bit of fun, but in general, kind of talking about this seriously has gone out of fashion a little bit. Mm-hmm. And when I started the Paranormal Podcast back in 2005, when nobody knew what a podcast was, mm-hmm. and I said, well, because I had decided I was going to start podcasting, and I said, well, what do I want to do something on? Because I just heard about it. My background had been broadcasting in school and so forth, and I had worked for numerous media outlets, but on the business side. And I said, well, I want to get out in front of the mic myself like I was in college, because that's what I thought I was going to originally do as my profession. It actually ended up happening, but years later. But funny. Anyhow, I thought, I want, what kind of podcast would I like to hear? And I said, well, I'm fascinated by the paranormal. Always have been. I was just like you. I would go to the library looking for those books, and they would usually have maybe one little shelf mm-hmm. of books. So the old Time Life books, if you remember those, ones that would... Yeah. But anyway, magazine. There was never enough. Yeah. So anyway, I said, well, I'm going to start the kind of podcast I'd like to hear where people talk about the paranormal seriously. And my first two guests were Stanton Friedman on UFOs and Lloyd Auerbach on ghosts. I mean, man,
wow.
I really lucked out. I don't know how, because I think when I said, would you please be a guest on my podcast, I think their reaction was, what's a podcast? I think that was everybody's reaction 13 years ago. And now they're on the tip of everybody's tongue. But the point being, there was hardly any. I mean, I looked it up, and it's like, I think I found 20. And at that time, I'm like, oh my gosh, there are 20. How am I ever going to compete with 20 podcasts?
I know.
But the funny thing was, and this is a hoot, and actually it has helped tremendously in the shows being discovered and so forth, is I thought, well, what can I call this? It's a podcast, and it's about the paranormal. What can I call it? Paranormal? It's a podcast. It's paranormal. It's a podcast. The Paranormal Podcast. I'm like, somebody has to have that.
And nobody had it.
Nobody had it.
That right there tells you that how early you got into this, because what a perfect name that is.
And it's been great for people discovering.
I had to change mine like 3 times, and I kept searching and searching and searching. I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe there's this tiny little place out in somewhat, in the woods somewhere that has that name. I have to change everything. You search and you search because you try to do your due diligence and you want to be ethical straight out the gate.
Right. Absolutely.
And do the right thing. And the first time I ever saw the name on that, I went, wow, he got in this early, because that is a perfect name. And I can't believe it wasn't taken. So good for you, Jim. Good for you.
Very lucky.
Yes, right? So through the years, we know you've been doing this a long time. I know there's some stories out there that just make you go, wow. What was that? And I personally know there's one that got you and it got me. And I think that's why it really took my attention when you were speaking about it. And I hate to ask you off the cuff, but I think you'll know what I'm talking about. In 1949, there was a case of possession of a young boy, in St. Louis, I believe. And that was the case that The Exorcist was based on.
Yes.
And that one actually made me think similar to how you did, like how much, if this can happen, how much is the individual influenced in their normal day? If evil can influence us, what's going on? Do you know what I mean? And I heard you on an interview speaking the same way. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? Because I thought that was very interesting the way you put it.
Well, here's the way that I feel, and I hope that I give you what you're looking for here. But the thing is I think there's a tendency here to think. Particularly, I interview for some of my shows, my premium shows and so forth, a lot of New Age people, and I think they've got some great thoughts. I mean, tapping into positive energy and things like that. Mm-hmm. I think that's all very valid and very good. Mm-hmm. But there seems to be this thought out there that, particularly in the New Age community, that, well, there isn't such thing as evil. And frankly, I don't know how you can look at the world and say that. Look at Jeffrey Dahmer. Look at Adolf Hitler. Look at James Earl Ray. Look at any legion of villains throughout history who have assassinated or mass murder, Jim Jones, things like that. And I believe, yes, there is, when somebody's a serial killer or something like that, and we delve into that on my true crime show as well, I think sometimes there definitely can be a component of mental illness, but I still think that evil exists. And there's an old saying, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.
Absolutely.
And I believe that there is a positive energy out there, and I think there's a negative energy out there, and I think that it exists. Now, some people think, that's just superstition or just kind of old thinking or whatever it might be, but I still believe that evil exists. I think in some rare cases that could take the form of something like that exorcism. I mean, the Catholic Church to this day practices exorcism.
Yes.
Also, though, I do think that people who are maybe mentally ill or something could be mistaken, and I think it's a very scary area to get into because,
It is.
I mean, how can I tell if somebody's, quote, possessed or if they're having mental issues? I don't feel that I'm qualified in any way.
Right.
But the point being is I definitely think evil is a real thing. And I think we have to keep that in mind. And I also think that there's genuine good in the world and good people and good spirits and so forth. So I think it's a balance. I think there is good, and yes, I think there is bad.
Yes, and I totally agree. I agree with all of that. And I also think that if you take out, I think people get kind of stumbled up when you start putting the spirituality or the religion into it. But if you just look at it as a science, then there's lower vibrational things, and then there's higher vibrational things. Between you can put a plant and play horrible loud screaming music at it and it will die, but if you put nice classical uplifting music, it flourishes. So it's just basically an energy if you think about it. So if we are influenceable, then we could definitely be influenced by either one. And
I would say this. I mean, I think sometimes people think when you talk about good and evil, you're necessarily subscribing to one religion or the other, and I don't believe that's the case. I think there can be good and bad, and there probably is in every religion that's out there.
Yep.
I'll give you a little anecdote that happened to me that really pointed to the good. It happened last week. Even though I'm a podcaster and I'm relatively popular in this space, I'm definitely in the middle class. I'm not a rich guy. I'm married. We have 2 kids. We have a mortgage. One girl going to college, not a cheap one, and those things. So we're like like a lot of families. We have one newer car that's really the nice car, and then we have the car that's just to go down the street and get the groceries. Well, I drive that most of the time. And last week I was driving that car, my trusty Honda Accord, or at least I thought. And I come out of the driveway and it makes this horrible noise, and I'm basically dead on the road. And someone or the police, they actually literally pushed me to a parking lot. And this particular parking lot was a Buddhist temple. And I was out there for about an hour and a half waiting for AAA for a tow truck. But anyhow, the point is that a woman came up in an SUV, a high-end SUV, and, was asking if I was okay or whatever. And then she went inside and did whatever clerical work or whatever it is that she had to do. And at first I thought, she's probably just suspicious, wondering what this guy's doing. And then about 45 minutes later, my wife had shown up in the good car waiting with me. And this woman comes out and brings us 2 bottles of water. Mm-hmm. And was very caring and said, did we need something or something like that? Now, she happened to be, I'm guessing, a Buddhist, I'm assuming. Mm-hmm. And it just shows you in every religion and people, all different spiritual traditions and things, there's good in the world. And I mean, that was such, the funny thing about it is like 2 bottles of water, Yeah. You could go to the discount store down the way and get them for $1.50. Mm-hmm. But the point is, that wasn't the point. It was that she took time to make sure that we are okay and give us water and check on us. And just a simple act of kindness. I could tell you that whole thing, which ended up costing me several $100s, that was the biggest takeaway I had from that whole experience, was that lady with the 2 bottles of water.
The simple act of kindness.
That there's still good people in the world. So I think just because we recognize that there's evil, I don't think we should be down about it. We just recognize it like you got to pay taxes, right?
Right, exactly. And, what she showed you too was just a simple act of kindness. A little bit of light brought into the darkness you were feeling that day and everything that was just happening. It brightened the whole thing up. And that's just, your mantra for life. If you're in the dark, lighten it up. And that's just how this works, And
it's one of those things.
How many stories have you had, Jim, where somebody was going through something like that, and then whatever their light was, let's just call it that, they brought that out and it stopped. If they were being attacked by something that wasn't very nice, they brought in their personal prayer, or they brought in their personal, asking for help, and they got it. or if they were,
Yep.
in their home, they just said, you're not welcome here. You have to go. And it left, whether we're
Right.
talking
Right.
about a human thing or any kind of thing. Because, I'm of the thing where I don't know enough to disbelieve anything can exist, to a certain extent.
Right.
And I don't have enough knowledge of what exists to say. Do you see what I'm saying? I'm always on the fence on stuff.
I feel the same way.
Yeah.
I feel the same way because who am I to say
Exactly.
something can't exist? We had somebody come on pretty early on the show and saying when he was a small child in the late 1960s that he swore on multiple occasions he saw when he was in bed what he perceived as a leprechaun.
Okay.
Now, the funny thing is, years later, decades later, his brother said, don't think you're crazy. I saw the same thing. Now, again, do I think he saw a literal leprechaun? I'm not sure of that, but maybe he saw some kind of spirit or he saw something that as a small child, you might naturally interpret it as a leprechaun. And a lot of people would laugh at that, but I won't laugh at it because I know strange things happen. And I believe our reality is very complicated. What I mean by that is that there's so much that we don't understand. Is I think sometimes we try to put things in frames that we can understand, but the truth is that maybe it's much more complicated. Maybe the truth is much more complicated. Maybe there's things like multiverses. Maybe there's things about alternate timelines. So for me to say, well, that's impossible, it can't exist. And that's one of the things that I get about the hardcore skeptics. Not people that come in with some skepticism. I think that's good. But people who are just like, well, none of this is true and it can't be true. Exactly. Well, that's silly because Cisco, here's the example I use. DNA. Now, in 1900, if you had told people about DNA and, we're all encoded and the genome and all that and tried to explain to them, it's like, this makes no sense. But it didn't mean it didn't exist. It just meant that the people of the time didn't have the technology. They didn't have the techniques. They didn't have the way of looking at things to understand it. There could be a whole other layer or layers of reality we just can't see and we can't understand. So to me, to say something definitely doesn't exist, that's very hard for me to do as well. And sometimes I feel like, Jim, you're copping out, but really,
you're not. You're not. I totally agree. That's exactly how I feel. We were just having a discussion the other night about with some other podcast friends of mine. We were talking about monsters and cryptids, and I said, well, think about it. Before people knew what a shark was,
right.
Was that a cryptid to them? I know we didn't have the term, but you get the point. Or the first time they saw a tiger, just because we don't know what this thing is, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And we don't have to, so it's the same thing. And I think in a lot of ways, ghosts and things like that are the same. And we were also talking about how far the paranormal has come with all of this evidence and all of the groups going out and the scientists and the shows and people just studying. It almost seems like we haven't gotten any further because everybody wants to put everything in what you were saying, like that paranormal file cabinet. We want to put everything in a category. And in some cases, Jim, they bleed over into the next one. As soon as you think you've got it, boy, that's it. There can be more
this
questions.
is a moving target.
Absolutely.
To me, this is a moving target.
Absolutely.
And then you get into, are these things related? You talked about In Search Of, and I remember on the intro, the classic intro of that show, they would say something, we will investigate things like strange disappearances, UFOs, monsters, and these different categories. And I used to think about all what we call the paranormal, and I tend to group it all together into the paranormal. Some people think paranormal is just ghosts. I think that's more of a recent kind of thing with the TV shows. To me, paranormal means cryptids, UFOs, ghosts, head scratchers, as I call them, all this stuff lumped together. But I used to think of it as like, okay, UFOs are over here, ghosts are over here. But I think at least in some cases, there may be some interrelation between these different phenomena.
Totally agree. Totally agree. I've had people, good friends of mine, they've been doing battlefield rescue. A lot of people don't realize all this is going on, but they basically just go into these battlefields like Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, and you name it, and try to get the ghosts there that don't realize they're dead to go, because it's been so long.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll say, they'll go in with several different sensitives and equipment, you name it. And they say that a lot of times there'll actually be things that appear to be aliens that are there with other entities that are trying to help them get those soldiers to understand. And I thought that was amazing, and I said, well, why wouldn't they? If they exist, which I can't say they don't, why wouldn't they be interested in helping a huge group of souls stop the suffering? If you think about it like that, it makes perfect sense that, other than angels and everything else all coming together. And it's like that picture where you see all those people holding hands, looking around the earth, and you've got everything in there. You got Native Americans, angels, fairies, you name it, if there are entities that care about, an energy moving on, why wouldn't they? It just,
right.
I can't say they wouldn't, so that's just amazing. So before, I know you've got a time limit here. I'd love to get some stories. You got any stories for us?
Well, I'll tell you one that is one of the weirdest stories we've ever had. It's called the Roadhouse Saloon. Okay. And there are different categories of stories: ghost stories, UFO stories, cryptid stories. Then there's my favorite category, the head scratcher.
Yes, yes.
And these are just ones that kind of make me go, what in the world happened there? Now, the neat thing is that listeners have confirmed that the place we're going to talk about actually exists. I can't say, I wasn't there. I can't say what happened, but boy, it is a great story. And the thing, I've talked to the storyteller a few times over the years. She always tells exactly the same story. And that's why it really resonated with me. I'm talking about T.I. from Michigan. At the time that this happened, she was up in Wisconsin with a friend, and they went to see a band. And this was very late at night. Maybe, they closed the place down. I think it was 2:00 in the morning, and they talked to the band a little bit. And then they set about their way. And they were about an hour from their destination. And they had to drive through a rural area and so forth. And T.I., part of the way home, a few minutes into the trip, says, bad luck, I've got to use the restroom. The call of nature is making its siren song. So her friend Bob says, well, I could always stop by the side of the road here. And T.I. says, no, I just drive fast. So anyway, a few minutes down the road, they come upon this roadhouse, this bar, and it's set off, and it's lit up like the proverbial Christmas tree. There's neon signs in the windows and so forth. And they think, oh, wow, what great luck is this? Everything's usually, bars, places that serve alcohol usually close, at least in my area, around 2:00 in the morning. And I think it was the same there. And it's like, this place is open. Let's not look a gift horse in the mouth. So they stop so T.I. can take care of business, as it were. And Bob goes to the bar and gets a couple of beers. And he said, we'll have one for the road, I guess, as they were, as she was finishing up. And Bob had mentioned he was really glad they came there because it was this mural, this Old West mural painted on the one wall. And he'd heard a lot about it, and he always wanted to see it. And it was kind of odd because the place was kind of strange. People they didn't acknowledge him very much. They were kind of smiling blankly. There was just kind of an odd group of people, but they thought, well, who knows? Mm-hmm. People are people.
Wow.
So anyway, they start looking at the mural, and they notice that the people who are physically in the bar are represented in the mural. You have this kind of big buff guy with a T-shirt on, strap type T-shirt, and he's the bartender in the mural. There's a couple ladies at the end of the bar, and these same ladies are depicted in the mural. And there's a couple of guys sitting at a table, same thing, they're in the mural. They thought, well, that's odd, and they started talking. He said, well, it's probably because the artist is a regular here, and these people are regulars, and this is kind of a salute and homage to them. So they kept drinking their beers, and this one guy comes up to T.I., and he has put Let's Twist Again by Chubby Checker on the jukebox. And he asks T.I. to dance. Now, T.I. happened to use a cane, so she showed the guy the cane and begged off and said, no, I don't do a lot of dancing. And she said actually she was glad she had it because the guy was just kind of nasty looking and had these rotten teeth, and it just she said she really didn't want to dance with him. So anyway, they're looking at this mural, and they notice there's like swinging doors that are like in the old TV westerns. And they notice like there's like two pillars of almost smoke developing. And they're looking back at it, looking at each other and looking back, and it looks like two figures are developing into the picture. Remember Polaroid pictures, how they would develop?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Well, that's what was happening, two figures. And they keep developing a little bit by a little bit. And they're watching this, and this is very odd. So they look a little more, and there's a picture of a woman with curly hair, and she has boots and a cane. And T.I. has curly hair, boots, and a cane.
Oh, no.
And then even more disturbing, the person next to her, a taller figure, a male, who looks just like Bob. T.I. and Bob look at each other and say, let's get out of here. So they said that they walked out briskly, and then these people were kind of beckoning them, come back, come back. So anyway, they closed the door, and according to T.I., once that door closed, the whole place went dark, like it had never been open. And when they came there had been cars in the parking lot. Now there was a car that T.I. and Bob came in. But that's not the end of the story. They decide to leave wisely. They go about their business, get home. T.I.'s much more brave than I am, Cisco. She comes back a day or two later with a friend of hers. Granted, she comes a little bit earlier in the evening. And the thing I should have mentioned about the Chubby Checker jukebox, it was a vinyl jukebox with records. So anyway, she walks in, and she walks over to the jukebox to see if the Chubby Checker song is there. Well, first of all, it's a totally different style jukebox. And by the way, it doesn't play records, it plays CDs. And Chubby Checker's not on it. So then she goes and talks to the bartender, who is a younger woman. And T.I. says, oh, I was in here the other night. Yeah, there's a lot of people here. She said, yeah, and there was a really good-looking bartender, young man. Big, burly kind of type. Said, no, must not have been here. The only bartenders are myself and my elderly father. And with that, I think T.I. finished her drink, and they left. Now, did she get into some kind of alternate universe, some kind of time slip? I can't tell you. But that's one of the freakiest stories ever from the Campfire. It's called the Roadhouse Saloon.
Absolutely freaky. And now I'm scratching my head. Because I've heard stories like this, Jim. They're not as many of them. Because when you have something like that happen to you, you almost don't want to remember it.
Right.
But then you've got all these question marks up there. First of all, what would have happened if they stayed? We'll never know. And how many people did stay? Or is everybody in that picture? I've heard one very similar, but it was a diner, that two guys pulled over very much for the same reason on a road trip. And they walked into the diner, and everybody there basically was a ghost. And they went back, and the diner was absolutely dilapidated. It hadn't been open for years, maybe decades. So how does that happen when you're interacting? You're able to drink the beer. You're able to, how in the world, are we in a time slip, like that? I don't know. That's freaky. I don't know how she went back.
She's got way more guts than me.
Exactly. But, inquiring minds want to know, I guess, right? And, it's like curiosity killed the cat. I don't know that I could have gone back.
No, not me.
Wow, that's amazing, Jim. That is just amazing. And see, this is why the paranormal is just so interesting because it would be almost impossible to put that in a category.
Yeah, exactly. Another kind of story, if you want to hear another one that I really love, are after-death communication stories, because there's certainly the scary and the spooky stories, but there's also, as we said, there's a continuum, and some of them are the more reassuring stories. And one that really stuck with me from early days on the show, maybe this was the first year of the show, was I think this woman was down south somewhere, South Carolina or somewhere around there. And when she was a teenager, probably 19 years old, maybe 20, she had worked for her parents. Her parents had a car lot, and she worked, I think, like a summer job for them. So anyway, it was a normal day, and her job first thing in the morning was to go out from the office and go inspect the lot and make sure that nobody had tampered with any cars or anything like that. So this one morning, she goes out and she's looking, and she finds a tiger butterfly on the ground, half dead.
Aww.
And all of a sudden, she started to weep and bawl and cry like she never did in memory. And she couldn't understand why, because, you know, she was kind of so-so on butterflies. She didn't have any great affection for them, no more than the average person. So she goes back to the office. Her mom is there, and her mom's trying to console her and ask her what's wrong and get her settled down. And nothing seems to work. And then they get a phone call, and the phone call is from this girl's grandmother. And the grandmother tells the mom, "You better come. Grandpa thinks he's dying." I guess the grandfather had a lot of chronic issues, had been undergoing, I think, cancer treatment, those kind of things. But there was no reason to think that there was anything dire that was going to happen that day. And they'd had other incidents like this, and it turned out not to be that big of a deal. But the mom said, "You know what? Are you okay? Can you stay here and kind of hold down the fort, and I'll go check on Grandpa and see what's going on?" So she says, okay. She calms down. The mom goes to the grandpa's, and, you know, it's 15 minutes away. And as soon as she gets over there, she realizes this is pretty serious. So she calls the daughter at the car dealership and says, "Lock up and come over to the hospital. I think this is pretty serious. You better get over here." So anyway, the young girl locks up, gets over to the hospital. She said she got over there record time. And she got to see her grandfather just before he passed. So anyway, after this happens, she goes to her home. And down south, you know, they have this great tradition. When somebody passes, they're really very supportive, and they cook for the family. And people were already bringing food in and things. And, you know, sometimes you just want to be by yourself. And she said, "I can't stand this. I got to get out. I got to go." And she said she drove and she drove and she drove, and she didn't even know how long she'd been driving. And she came upon this park, and she'd never been at that park before in her life. And in fact, she still doesn't know where that park was. And she saw a bench, and she said, "I'm going to go sit down on that bench." So she stops her car, parks her car, goes and sits down on that bench. She's there just a couple of moments, and she gets swarmed by a whole flock of tiger butterflies. She said they were in her hair, they were in her face, they were everywhere. And she took that, and she just cried and cried, but then she felt much, much better. And she just took that as a sign from her grandfather that everything was okay and not to worry. And she says even to this day, that her and her mom, it could be the dead of winter, but when they're having a bad day and they're depressed, they look out the window, and what do they see? A tiger butterfly. And I love that story.
I love that story too. And oddly enough, my son and I were just talking about that yesterday, because he was actually looking up the migration of the monarch butterfly. And it's so intriguing if you think about how they get together. They go... because we have constantly been seeing a monarch butterfly. And I just know that in our times of struggle, it's my mother saying everything's fine, you know, but we see them, like you said, the dead of winter, and I'm in New Jersey, so I defy a butterfly to live out in some of the weather we have. And they just show up at all these times, and you just know. And I think once you connect into that, whether you say telepathically or energy or whatever, and they know you notice, it happens even more often, So that's wonderful. It's just wonderful. And it just goes to show that, there is, that good energy I think it's, if you really look at you said balance earlier, but I honestly believe that when you start opening yourself up to this, the good outweighs the bad. It really does, because we tend to.
Oh, I believe that too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I do. We tend to, wash a lot of that away, or not pick up the signs our loved ones are leaving us. The feathers, the coins, there is no coincidence in the paranormal when it comes to, what they'll do to communicate with us. I'm sure you have a lot of stories about after death communication.
Yeah, I have. I know we're growing a little short on time, but I have one more I'll tell you, and this happened to my wife.
Okay.
And I thought this was really dramatic. This is before I ever podcast. 2001, actually shortly before 9/11. And my mother-in-law had been very ill, and she was brought to at-home hospice. But there was no feeling that anything was imminent within the next few days. The thought was she had weeks. So anyway, a few nights after she came home, the one particular night, my wife would spend a lot of time over there, which was totally understandable. And I was at home with our young daughter, who was just at that point almost 2. And anyway, this one particular night, my wife sensed that my mother-in-law was trying to shoo her away. She said, "Your husband's at home. You've got a little girl over there. You need to get home." And my wife's like, "That's okay. It's no problem." And she said, "No, you've got to get home." So anyway, she comes home. We spend the rest of the evening, and then we go to bed normally. And I don't know if it was about 2:00 in the morning. My wife wakes up. Now I am like, no pun intended, waking the dead. When I'm asleep, forget it. She said she woke up and looked over my shoulder, and she saw a vision of Mother Mary. And she said it wasn't like anything you saw in artist depictions or movies. She said just very peaceful, very serene, just indescribable beauty. And she saw there as much as she saw me lying in the bed, that it was very real, and she's kind of glowing. And that was she even said she kind of rubbed her eyes just to make sure she wasn't dreaming, and she wasn't. So anyway, that happened. And about a half hour later, the phone rang. It's my father-in-law. And he tells my wife she's gone. And my wife says, "Who's gone?" She said, "Your mother. She just passed away about a half hour ago." Now, the thing you have to know is my wife's family's Catholic. Mother Mary was a huge deal for my mother-in-law. I guess when she was married, she was going to get roses for the Mother Mary, but there was some kind of rose shortage or something because she got married in January around the Rose Bowl parade or whatever. But I mean, that was a big focus of her religious life, was the Mother Mary. So it really was a meaningful thing. I mean, that is too coincidental to be a coincidence, Cisco. Like you said, there are no coincidences. And ironically, the next day, in her mailbox, when she got the family's mail, she found a bunch of rose petals. And there are roses in the yard, but they were in the backyard, not in the front. So where did those rose petals come from? So it was like a double sign from her mom. And I think, again, I do think they try to tell us that they're okay and that they live on and that they're around. Absolutely. So I think that's what was going on.
Absolutely. And, you've got years of information on this, and I know I do too, out of personal experiences. And it's absolutely they try to tell us that they're okay and life does go on in some form. And I think that's the big question in the paranormal. I think that's what all the investigation is really about.
Yep.
You know,
that's
what
I think
happens
too.
after the fact. So I know we have to let you go. So I hope this isn't the first time you'll come on this side of the gate and walk with us and take us through. And maybe sometime I can come on and tell you some of my ghost stories as well. And we'll just have a good old ghost party. What do you think?
I think that's a good idea, and I hope everybody gets to check out my shows if they haven't heard of them.
Yes.
Over at jimharold.com, JIMHAROLD.com. They can find there's 5 Campfire books at jimharoldbooks.com and also on Amazon. They're true ghost stories, Jim Harold's Campfire. Just look up Jim Harold, you'll find it.
Yes.
And then, of course, the podcasts are also heard on all the major podcast apps, Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, everywhere you can listen to fine podcasts. And Cisco, thank you again for this great opportunity to spend some time with you and your audience. I look forward to continuing the conversation in the future.
Absolutely. You just have a wonderful day, Jim, and be careful out there because it's a little spooky.
I will. Mm-hmm.